Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So, last time we were talking about terrestrial biomes and how different plant communities, animal communities, the climate, all of that sort of drives the characteristics that we see in these sort of big global regional ecosystems. We're going to dive in today and talk about what that means when we talk about aquatic or water biomes, because now we're not talking necessarily about temperature and climate and average precipitation. Instead, the limiting factors that determine the types of water biomes that we see have certainly different characteristics. So, when we talk about limiting factors in these water biomes, in terms of how do we classify them, we first talk about the amount of salt or the salinity. Are we talking about freshwater biomes or are we talking about saltwater biomes? We then talk about the amount of dissolved oxygen, so how much oxygen is being bubbled into that water, because that certainly is going to play a role in the adaptations of the organisms that can live there, as well as the amount of sunlight. So just like we see the temperature and the soil and the nutrients and all that kind of thing really driving the adaptations and evolution of organisms, both plant and animal, that live in those terrestrial biomes, these are going to be the major contributing factors that drive the adaptations for organisms that we see in our aquatic ecosystems. So when we talk about water biomes, let's first divvy them out by that salinity. So if we're talking fresh water, then we're talking about things like rivers and streams, things that flow, as opposed to lakes and ponds that are a little bit more stagnant. The salt water, then, those ecosystems really are driven by oceans. So how much salt water do we have? What depth are we looking at? How far from shore are we? Estuaries, which are sort of almost in between, because we're going to see where sort of those freshwater rivers and things like that sort of dump out into those oceans, because they are certainly connected, as well as the seashores or the tidal areas where they're dealing with the high and low tides, and that in and of itself drives some interesting adaptations. So when we look at sort of major biomes, I gave you this big map of those terrestrial biomes, and here is sort of looking at a very similar idea when we talk about the major aquatic biomes on the globe. So you can see some of the big major lakes, like our Great Lakes here in the US. You've got major rivers. We can talk about intertidal zones right along the coastlines. Abyssal zones, we'll talk about what those mean, but there's some really deep places in the oceans. Coral reefs, there's a lot of them over here around Australia and the islands of New Zealand and places like that as well. So lots of interesting things to take a look at. And just like with the terrestrial biomes, you could spend days, years, months, your entire life studying aquatic biomes. So today's purpose really is just to kind of give you a big brief overview, kind of get your feet wet, if you will. So when we talk freshwater biomes, right, these guys are very much connected to that idea of salinity. And this is where we're going to have very low salinity. There's little or no salt at all. Doesn't mean that they're completely devoid of it, but just incredibly minimal. So we can then split those freshwater biomes out by dissolved oxygen. Am I flowing? Things like the rivers and the streams. Are we still freshwater, more like those lakes and ponds? And then we can also talk about then how fast are we flowing, or how deep is that still freshwater ecosystem. So freshwater flowing, right? We're talking things like streams. So these guys tend to be smaller, more narrow, don't tend to be particularly deep, but they tend to move much quicker. And the faster the stream flows, the more amount of dissolved oxygen that will get bubbled into it. So much higher dissolved oxygen, which, when you remember, oxygen is necessary for things like cellular respiration to make ATP. That's still happening in aquatic organisms, so the more oxygen present, the more efficient they can do that process. That being said, fish that live in streams like this have to be adapted to living in these fast-moving currents. So they have to be more streamlined or have an ability to sort of anchor themselves to a particular location, depending on what kind of organism we're talking about. But Faster water, more dissolved oxygen. Your rivers, on the other hand, tend to move slower. Bigger it is, the deeper it is, generally speaking, the slower it moves. And as a result, that does mean that a lot of debris can get collected off the sides of its banks and end up settling to the bottom. So, because of this, these rivers are moving slower, which means less dissolved oxygen. But on the flip side, because they can have that settling out, they do actually tend to have a higher nutrient content. So again, organisms who live here have to have adapted to that lower oxygen content of the water, but the benefit to it is a higher nutrient content. And so how do they manage that balance? Your ponds, these guys tend to be small, they're more shallow typically, and as a result, generally the sunlight is able to penetrate all the way to the bottom. And because that sunlight is capable of being there, these guys tend to be pretty filled up with plant material all the way down and through, because they have the access to the sunlight to do photosynthesis, which does mean that they are probably outputting some additional oxygen, but they're also utilizing other nutrients as well. So as they break down and decompose, however, they themselves can also output pretty high amounts of nutrients. So when we look at ponds, because of that accessibility to sunlight, we tend to see some pretty high amounts of nutrients in these types of environments, but they're smaller, they're more shallow, and so we can't have huge organisms living in these types of ecosystems. Your lakes, on the other hand, larger, deeper, and so the sunlight will often not be able to penetrate all the way to the bottom. So your plants will cease to exist, your aquatic plants will cease to exist after a certain depth. And a lot of that plant growth tends to be limited to the shoreline and just a bit further out. So when we get to those sort of center, really deep parts of those lakes, you're not seeing plant life. So we can break down those lakes and ponds into sort of three zones based on where it is with relation to the shoreline and then the depth as well. So when we look at the shoreline, right here, okay, we're talking about what we call the littoral zone. So you tend to have quite a bit of plant life here, both plant life right on the shore that can kind of fall in and provide nutrients as it decomposes, as well as other aquatic plants that kind of just hang out right there at the shoreline. We get out into our limnetic zone, and this is your open water. Okay, so we're moving further and further out from that shoreline. We then have the benthic zone, which really just runs right along the bottom here. So in things like bigger ponds, bigger lakes, a lot of debris will fall down there and a lot of decomposition is happening down here. Organisms that are capable of sort of crawling, like our cute little crabs here, may spend some time down here in these benthic zones. And if this is deep enough, we may have a photic versus an aphotic zone. So photic, photo, like light, where there is light penetration happening all the way through. And aphotic, right, A meaning a lack of, so lack of light if we get deep enough, depending on how deep that lake or that pond is. So moving away from those freshwater and into saltwater environments, then we have to talk about these estuaries or sort of wetlands. And these are partially enclosed bodies of water where a river meets the ocean. So we get some really cool ecosystem gradients that happen within estuaries. So when we look at something like the Chesapeake Bay, we talk about things like the Delaware River dumping into that Chesapeake. So when we talk really high up in the bay here, this is mostly mostly fresh water. But the further and further you get down, places where the Potomac is running in, starting to get a little saltier, till we get to the mouth of that bay and out into the Atlantic Ocean, and now we're talking almost a fully oceanic salinity. They tend to be located near coastlines because they are dumping the water from runoff from the land into these areas. They also are bordered by land as a result of that. They are very fertile, assuming things are going appropriately, because you're getting a lot of churning of nutrients from the land itself, as well as some of that salinity and that salt and the nutrients coming in from the oceans. So the nutrient levels are pretty much higher than what we would see in a freshwater environment by itself or a saltwater environment by itself, because we're really kind of churning everything together and mixing it all up. That being said, these have a particular vulnerability, if you will, to things like pollution. So not only are these particularly fertile in terms of just the amount of nutrients and oxygen and things that are there compared to a freshwater environment or a saltwater environment, these are often more protected, if you will, by the land itself. And so a lot of oceanic species will come into these places as sort of safe havens to reproduce. Um, but because do a lot of things as humans up on land, that pollution can get washed away. And so the Chesapeake Bay has historically been a place of study because of all the farming, right? So a lot of the watershed, a lot of the land runoff that comes into the Chesapeake is coming from places like here and like Lancaster. And there's tons of farming, which means lots of pesticides, lots of fertilizers being dumped on that land in efforts to grow crops. So we have to be careful how much we put out there and how much is getting used by the crops that we intend and how much is just kind of running off into the water, and was ending up being dumped, and it still is, although we're doing our best to remediate as much as we can, being dumped into the Chesapeake and really having some major detrimental effects to the balance of this very delicate but very important ecosystem for our aquatic organisms. When we get to nutrient cycles, we'll come back to that idea a little bit and we'll talk a little more about what that kind of fertilizer and pollution runoff can do to places like this. While we're talking about water biomes, let's talk about the sort of base of their food chain. So when we look at food chains on Earth, most kids recognize that plants are the ones who are bringing in the majority of the sunlight, converting it into energy that other organisms of the food chain then consume. When we look at water biomes, plankton are often the major, what we'll talk about as primary productive organisms, primary productivity. Um, these are sort of the base of most aquatic food chains. And so plankton are microscopic algae, they're plants. You can talk about photoplankton, so organisms that are capable of doing the photosynthetic process like the algae in the plants, or they can be zooplankton, so they are just sort of one step up that food chain, being little heterotrophs. So they're eating the phytoplankton, and then those zooplankton get eaten by larger organisms. These guys tend to float right on the surface of the water. Most of them are very much dependent on sunlight for either the photosynthesis itself or because they're eating those photosynthetic organisms, so they definitely need that sunlight to survive. But this is the base support to most food chains in aquatic ecosystems. So there are our phytoplankton, right? These are our important little producers, and they are the first step in many of those aquatic food chains. They'll perform photosynthesis overwhelmingly. And then you've got your zooplankton, who are microscopic consumers. So sort of one step up the food chain from those phytoplankton, and then bigger fish will come in and start eating those zooplankton to be eaten by bigger fish, to be eaten by bigger fish, so on and so forth. So if we're talking saltwater biomes and we're sort of moving away from just those estuaries that are the connection between freshwater on land and the big oceans, let's talk about how we divvy out ecosystems within these saltwater biomes then. Because about 95% of water on Earth has a really high concentration of salt. It's a high salinity environment, So they would be defined as these saltwater biomes, and most of that is ocean. So when we look at some of the basic components, we're going to see some names that we saw when we talked about those freshwater sort of ponds and lakes, right? So we've got that benthic zone again, so sort of the bottom of the ocean. We do have a photic zone and an aphotic zone. We've got that open water, so you can talk about it as the pelagic zone here in the ocean. You can use that term as well in freshwater ecosystems. If you take a look back here, right, I did throw that pelagic zone here, but you also come across it as a limnetic zone in those lakes and ponds. So you could use that term in both, or the limnetic seems to be a little more specific to talking about lakes and ponds instead. So we've got that pelagic zone or open water. When we look kind of at the surface, we can talk about our intertidal zone. All right, so if you've ever been to the seashore, you know what that intertidal zone looks like. And it's really just the distinction between that high tide line, so how far can the water come in when the tide is high, as opposed to the other end of it being where water is at its lowest point when it's at low tide. Just beyond that low tide line then, out to the edge of our continental shelf, is our noritic zone, and then from there on out is your oceanic zone. So let's walk through those different zones. Your seashores or your intertidal zone is the portion of the shoreline that is covered by water at high tide and exposed to the air at low tide. And so these tides have an incredibly huge influence on the life that can live there and the adaptations necessary to survive in such organisms that are able to survive in such opposing environments on a pretty regular day-to-day basis. So when we look at intertidal zones, we can classify them either as sandy, which if you've ever been to sort of the Jersey Shore, you've experienced a sandy intertidal zone, or they can be rocky, and we see a lot of those rocky intertidal zones the further up the east coast you go, as well as a lot of the upper end of the west coast is also pretty rocky. And so we find all sorts of really cool organisms here that are capable of handling that in and out of the tides. So some small fish can exist here, clams, crabs. Um, those guys can kind of move around. Crabs in particular can move in and out as the tides go. Mussels. And a lot of these guys, especially in those rocky intertidal zones, will get trapped in these tide pools, which if you've ever had the chance or get the chance to go take a look at tide pools in your life, they're really kind of cool. They are their own little microcosm of oceanic life, and it's really neat to see. And so you'll find things like sea stars and anemones and the little crabs. Sometimes you'll get a couple little fish going on there. Um, and they have to have some really interesting adaptations in the sense that they have to be able to handle huge temperature swings. So as the tides come in, it'll bring in cool fresh water. But as the tides recede, these guys will get filled up for the most part with water, but they almost become their own little cookers. So as that sun is beating down, the energy is coming in, these guys warm up and evaporation can happen pretty rapidly depending on the atmospheric conditions at the time. So some really interesting organisms to be able to survive and live in these tide pools. And the case is the same for any organism that's going to hang out here in this intertidal zone by being washed in and out by those tides. They've got to be able to deal with that extra exertion, that pressure that comes with those tides. If you've ever stood in a tide, it can be enough. A wave can come crashing in and knock you over. So these guys have to be able to deal with that sort of very churning up of the water, the pressure that comes with that. And so a lot of these guys will have harder shells or just be capable of movement, right? If you get trapped inshore when the tide goes out, if you are dependent on water in order to gain your oxygen, you don't have a way to breathe oxygen out of the air, you better have a way to get yourself back to the water. Otherwise, you are going to be drying out on land. Okay, so let's move out a little further and talk about the noritic zone. So this is the area of the ocean from that low tide line, so we're past the intertidal zone, all the way out to the edge of the continental shelf. Relatively speaking, in terms of the whole ocean, this is relatively shallow. And so we typically see this all within our photic zone. So some amount of sunlight generally reaches the bottom of this neritic zone. And so that means that organisms who live here certainly depend on photosynthesis, whether it's because they do photosynthesis themselves or because they are dependent on food chains that are ultimately built on photosynthetic organisms. So your phytoplankton are here, your seaweeds. We get a lot of mollusks and sponges, crustaceans, sea worms, and then a lot of the cute organisms, if you will, that kids associate with the ocean. So our sea turtles, our manatees, my personal favorite, the sea otters. These guys are all hanging out here. This is where we see most of the fish. Most of the marine mammals are going to hang out here in these neritic zones. Part of that, this is also where we can come across coral reefs. So these are part of that neritic zone as well, and they are living organisms. So if you've seen Finding Nemo, then you know kind of what this looks like. So, and if you've ever had the chance to get to see one of these in person, I am super jealous. So cool, right? So these guys are actually colonies of coral polyps. So little organisms that live in these colonies that form all of these different really interesting and creative and just beautiful structures, these coral structures that actually secrete a hard exoskeleton, and that's what you're looking at there. Um, Huge, rich biodiversity. You can sort of think of this as the marine equivalent to tropical rainforests. More than 1 in 4 marine species actually inhabits, I should say, a coral reef. So we see sponges and sea anemones, the sea worms, sea stars, mollusks, sea turtles, fish, algae, zooplankton, cute little Dories and Nemos, right? Clownfish. So all of those sorts of things are hanging out here and really, really beautiful. But also, once again, very sensitive to a lot of things that are going on globally right now. And so we have to be very careful about our conservation efforts in a means to keep these high biodiversity ecosystems stable and healthy. Kelp forests can also exist here in this neritic zone. These guys tend to be more in cold, nutrient-rich waters. One of the biggest kelp forests that we are maybe familiar with here in the US exist off the coast of Washington. And these guys are very much composed of large communities of kelp, or these giant seaweeds. Super huge areas of high productivity because those seaweeds are producers, right? They do photosynthesis. So this also supports a lot of organisms as well, like our harbor seals here, our cute little sea otters, lots of starfish, sea urchins, all kinds of things that hang out here. Um, Whales will come in here to reproduce, so also very much needed and very much important ecosystems in the oceans. Okay, moving on out, talk about the ocean zone. This is the vast majority of the ocean. It's from the edge of the continental shelf until we get to the next continental shelf on the other side. And so when we divide and look at the ocean zones, we're typically dividing them into, do they get sunlight or do they not? So your photic zone is going to be down to the point where the sunlight can penetrate. Once we get past that point, then we talk about your aphotic zone where that sunlight is no longer able to penetrate because we're just so deep the photons, the light can't make it. So typically, photic zone is somewhere above approximately 200 meters. It is made up of your euphotic versus dysphotic zones. So euphotic sort of being right at the top, dysphotic where it's really starting to get a little murky, but you can still kind of make out the sunlight. And this is where the vast majority of plant and animal life exists. We get below that aphotic zone, and again, if you've seen Finding Nemo, you've seen that really crazy anglerfish there in that picture. This we're talking about below about 200 meters, and the sunlight doesn't make it here. So there are no plants. All of the organisms down here are dependent on raining down of nutrients from things that are decaying and dying in the photic zone. And the organisms down here have to have some very highly specialized um, structures and ways that they function. So they will certainly have some very translucent flesh. There's not much need for much pigmentation down here because nobody can really see much. Um, they have some high connections to either other organisms that are capable of bioluminescing so that they can make light, or they themselves are capable of doing that. And all of that is a means to be able to attract mates, attract predators, scare off predators, whatever the case might be. Also have to be able to deal with a lot of high pressure. The deeper and deeper we go, the pressure of the ocean water pressing in on an organism greatly increases. All right, so the bathyal zone is from the edge of your neritic zone to the base of the continental shelf. So basically this big drop off, right? And this is going to be characterized by a lot of turbid, murky water, accumulation of silt of things that are being washed in and out from the tides. Um, there are some major currents that are hitting the edges of this wall, and so organisms who have to live here have to adapt to not only the high pressures, but also a lot of that accumulation of silt and potentially some bombardment of currents that are coming through. So a lot of burrowing organisms here that kind of just burrow themselves into the dirt, into the silt, and hang out. We'll see some squid and some octopi that hang out here as well. They can be higher or lower depending on what their adaptations are in their sort of particular species, but they are something else that we might find here as well. And then the abyssal zone. So these guys are, we're talking below 2,000 meters now. And the total number of species in this zone is incredibly small compared to anything above this. Sort of these denizens of the deep ocean, if you will, sort of creepy, crazy looking things. This is very much where that bioluminescence is absolutely necessary. And again, it's there either as a way to attract predators, scare off the predators, attract mates, whatever the case might be. And so they're capable of making their own light. Some of the organisms are capable of doing that bioluminescence completely on their own based on the chemical reactions that are going on in their body. Others will have symbiotic relationships with bacteria that live in or on them. And it's the bacteria instead that are capable of doing that bioluminescence. Another interesting ecosystem down here in the deep is the hydrothermal vents. So these are spots on the ocean floor where we've got hot gases and minerals that are escaping from Earth's interior, and lots of really crazy, cool, interesting ecosystems, um, organisms that are surviving in these hydrothermal vent ecosystems. This is where we talk about initially that idea of chemosynthesis. So being this deep, we've got to have ways to have some primary productivity, have some organisms who are capable of making their own food. But because there's no sunlight, photosynthesis is not an option. And so instead, they'll use chemicals that are spewing out of these vents to go through a chemosynthetic process where they can take energy from those chemicals and make them into things like sugars that can then be broken down into ATP. Keep in mind, we often associate chemosynthesis with hydrothermal vents, although this is not the only place that organisms that go through chemosynthesis can exist. It certainly makes logical sense that this is where we would expect them to be because there's no light, but there are organisms who are chemosynthetic that do exist on the surface. It's just the way that they happen to have evolved their means of metabolism as opposed to going through photosynthesis instead.